As mentioned there, there's a lot to discuss. There's been a lot of capital come into the space over the last couple of years, especially in the kind of huge wave of capital coming in 2020 and 2021. And clearly there's an enthusiasm from institutional investors to get involved with the psychedelic space, and maybe even one day big pharma. So there's a lot to discuss. Maybe the best way of introduction is just to go through everyone and see how you first came across kind of psychedelics, where you've approached it from. So Ritu Baral is here. She's a senior biotech analyst at Cowen. Where did it start for you?
So for me, it really came from my own focus. So we at Cowen, across the 5 or 6 biotech analysts we have therapeutic focus. And I focus on neuropsychiatry, rare diseases, and some fibrotic diseases. I'm a neuropsych person. I've covered the standard run-of-the-mill biotechs emerging in the neuropsychiatry space, and I pay special attention to novel mechanisms. One of the things that struck me as I was doing the reading on psychedelics, in this case, the background was for my own family interest. Unfortunately, my husband's family has a history of treatment-resistant depression, and one day he plopped a pile of academic papers on my desk and said, "Tell me what you think of this, you would know." And I realized all of the authors on those papers were my KOLs, my key opinion leaders, the people that I talked to about GABAergic agents, the people that I talked to about serotonergic agents, the people I was talking to about Spravato. And I went through a pile of papers this big, one evening from 9 o'clock to 2 a.m. in the morning, because I literally couldn't stop reading. And it was just a very, very compelling set of publication, data set that was out there. And this was about the 2016, 2017 timeframe, when I think psychedelics as an investable opportunity hadn't really bubbled up to what we call specialist biotech investors. I may have been about 18 months ahead of the game, but the basis for the investment, that sort of data set, was already there.
Mm. And it's the data that's so compelling, and we'll get onto that later. We've also got Michael Jiang here, who can talk to the investment banking side. He's a managing director, senior managing director at Guggenheim. Michael, how were you introduced to the psychedelic space?
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. I think psychedelics have become an emerging field for both investors and obviously kind of experts in the industry. And over the last 4 or 5 years, I've come across a number of investors looking to make investments in the space, kind of asking us, when does this become more mainstream? And obviously working with a number of earlier stage companies, helping them raise capital, both publicly and privately, over the last 4 or 5 years. Incidentally, actually, in 2013, I actually worked on the US IPO for GW Pharma, which is tangentially correlated, but have kind of been working in the space for a while.
And finally, but last but not least, Suprotik Basu from Helena Special Investments, one of the board members at Lycos, which has an adcom coming up for the FDA, and we'll talk about that later. Suprotik, how did you get involved and start investing in the space, and how do you see it at the minute?
Totally accidentally. Is the reality. I didn't originally come from the psychedelic space. My background's originally in global public health before I became an investor, and I was invited actually to a PSFC meeting. It was covered up Psychedelic Science Funders Collaborative with Monica and a few others in this audience here. And in a previous life, I used to help oversee the UN's global malaria control program, and I had seen what happened when inflection points happen, when things really start to go to scale. And so a few friends, Jeff Walker and Austin Hurst and a couple of others, and Joe Green invited me to this meeting to think, how can there be some lessons learned between what happened there and in the psychedelic space? And I thought I was going for one meeting, and that was it. And then I met the people and I looked at the data. And Roland Griffiths was at this meeting, and we went for a long walk in the Redwoods. We went through all the data, and I was absolutely just blown away. And I left that meeting, and eventually a bunch of folks wore me down. I was interested in it from a movement standpoint, but they said, "Don't you run a fund?" And I was like, "I do, but there's no way this space is investable." And long story short, I determined, and our team determined that it was, and we ended up leading the deal in Lycos, and now looking at a number of other transactions. But I got the bug, and I couldn't go back. So.
And there's definitely been a move in the past few years from philanthropic capital backing the space and sustaining it to now big institutional blue chip healthcare investors. You look at the cap table of something like Compass, got to mention it, a London-based biotech. Maybe we could start with just saying how the space is adjusting to that kind of slowing down. Every biotech had a glut of money in 2020 and 2021. Psychedelic biotechs benefited from that. What's the kind of aftermath of that? How's the space adjusting to that landing, Ritu?
So I would say the psychedelic space actually had two tailwinds. One, biotech had a 10-year bull market. And there was additional interest a few years ago in the psychedelic space. So you really had sort of two inflows of money. You had a lot of specialist interest that had a lot of specialist biotech bull market money. And then you had generalist money, retail money coming from the psychedelic side. And I think that's why when all the markets pulled back, you saw an especially hard pullback of psychedelic valuations and compression of multiples, as we call it, which is just a fancy way of saying things went down a lot, more than most. That's where we are, and in order to claw their way into operating capital, to make payroll, right, to pay their contract research organizations, you have to do a few things. You have to basically have a roadmap. You have to have a clear roadmap. When are you going to produce data? When are you going to approach the FDA? When are you going to talk to FDA? And when do you think, nothing's ever certain, when are you going to file, and when is that timeline to the first dollar? Now, going back to what I said about the data and going back to actually the tail end of the last presenter, where this is coming from and the specialists who are putting money behind it, I think we all sort of look at that data and we see such high rates of remission, such high rates of response compared to what's in the landscape right now with cheap generics, and say, with those rates of remission and response, somebody's going to be able to make a health technology assessment that the insurance companies are going to have to pay attention to. It's those remission rates that, at least in my work, I focus on, and I just can't help but think that once that data set evolves, the money, it will save money, and therefore, that's what insurance companies are all about, they will come. If you build that data set, it will come.
And presumably, Michael, you've just seen it in, obviously you specialize in equity capital markets at Guggenheim, you've just seen it in, there's been a bit less business, right? Coming from biotechs and psychedelic biotechs over the past couple of years. Is that picking up now?
Yeah, definitely. I think the couple of things. I think the overall health of the biotech markets have improved the last 4 to 6 months, thankfully. I think what we've seen from some of the public companies in the space is phase 2B data, right? That showed kind of lasting, durable efficacy that investors were really encouraged by. I think there's been a couple of events in the space over time that have continued to de-risk the investment thesis for investors. I think the first wave in the early 2020s, right, came on the back of Spravato being approved. It took a while for Spravato to really kind of get to an inflection point from a sales perspective. It wasn't overnight, but now that people see a path and line of sight to being a multi-billion-dollar drug, as J&J says, I think that's catalyzed a lot more investment and interest in the space. I also think there's been challenges for traditional kind of neuropsych development in other companies where the profound efficacy that Ritu was referring to, I think people have to pay attention, right? And now we have, additional watershed events in the space hopefully coming up later this year.
And just to follow on something Michael said, for as long as Spravato wasn't selling, it was an overhang on the space. It was a headwind that hopefully.
And now it's a tailwind.
Through. Now it's starting to become a tailwind. I mean, it's fine for J&J to flap their hands and say, COVID, COVID, COVID. But as many launches are emerging out of COVID that they now are starting to grow, gives the whole paradigm, that whole therapeutic paradigm, credibility.
And another thing that seems to be doing that is some of the cap tables, some of the rounds that have happened of late. When you look at Compass Pathways cap table as an example, they've got big names like RA Capital on there. And that is, in many ways, an endorsement of the kind of legitimization of the space. Protic, you did quite a big round at the beginning of the year. $100 million for Lycos. What's that kind of done in that kind of question of proving out to investors, interest from investors, and kind of legitimizing what you have?
Yeah, I think that, Lycos, it's a somewhat of a unique asset because it must be the first domino to fall, right? And so it is the precedent-setting asset. And because it's a later stage asset, I think the challenge with a company like that is it sort of falls, but it's neither fish nor fowl from an investor standpoint, right? It's too late because of all, thanks to Rick and others, it was so strongly philanthropically funded for so long. It actually missed in some ways the need for that early stage traditional biotechnology capital that most of these big funds are used to investing in. And they're used to underwriting that risk with their 50 PhDs that work for these companies, et cetera. But they're not late stage enough to yet, at least when the Series A was done, to have gone commercial. You weren't underwriting commercial. So you kind of were stuck in this kind of middle territory that required more of a venture capital fund like ours to come in and help fill that gap. I think as Lycos, has these threshold moments like the advisory committee and hopefully approval later in the summer, you'll start to see, I think it's our hope, that more and more investors that are looking to lean into the commercialization pathway in the space will start to find it attractive. And so this will, and to Dan's earlier conversation, this is the challenge, is that so far the investors in the space have been relatively niche and have been taking largely early stage bets. But as those earlier stage companies start to mature into commercialization, near commercialization, we'll have to expand beyond just even the traditional biotechs to those who are investing in pharmaceutical companies and those who are investing in actual commercialization infrastructure. That will be the next, I think, big switch for the space to address.
And how have you found engagement with regulators? Because the FDA has last year, in a big plus for the sector, laid out a guideline, a pathway for how to get to approval. How has kind of Lycos seen that from your side, from the business side?
Yeah, this is where I get shot by the attorneys, and so I'm going to try not to say too much about it. But don't worry about the attorneys. Don't worry about the attorneys. Rick and I never worry about the attorneys. But no, I think that there are so many who said that the file would not get breakthrough therapy designation and then priority review. We got priority review. Suddenly those people are now very quiet. The next stage gate, as the FDA announced yesterday or 2 days ago, is June 4th for the advisory committee. This is a watershed moment for the space, right? The first time in 25 years that any treatment for PTSD is coming up for the FDA for an AdCom. It's a massive moment. So I think the next 2 or 3 months are going to just be incredibly important from Rick's perspective. And what's interesting is you get to see a lot of public companies that are hitting milestones of their own right, but I think, as Ritu and Michael will attest, are also drafting off, the priority review, the AdCom. So every kind of milestone moment that Lycos hits or doesn't hit, you can kind of see this reaction in the public markets that's somewhat endogenous to their data, but somewhat exogenous related to what Lycos is doing. So it's going to be a fascinating kind of non-linear roller coaster over the next 6 months.
I want to add something about FDA because I can't get into trouble with FDA. I'm not a stakeholder there. I do cover a lot of neuropsych companies, and the neuropsych division within FDA has been challenged the last 2 or 3 years. I think it's been a staffing issue. They've been very late with some approvals. They've been very late with corporate filing, application filing communications, clinical holds, et cetera. It's something that we've noticed, and actually it's been a particular problem within neuropsych, again, probably because of staffing issues. So the fact that they came out with this guidance in the middle of everything when they were so slammed and behind, I actually approached Tiffany Farchione at ACMP at the end of this year, and really, from the investor side, I basically said, thank you, you're legitimizing this whole space. And it was clear to me what what an agency focus, what an initiative focus it is for her division when she's scrambling to keep up with her work and her team's work to to really pull that together in a very sort of tight and detailed document. So that struck me.
And there's certainly been some kind of doubters along the way. ISA, you know, the non-profit that opines about drug pricing and how clinical trials work, opines about a lot of things.
Yes.
They put out what might be interpreted as somewhat of a negative report about Lykos's trials, but they put out the same thing about Spravato's trials, and now Spravato has turned into a huge success. Before we move on to looking at kind of the future, I just want to dwell a little bit on Spravato. The fact that J&J, the family company, their fastest growing drug in terms of percentage increase is a drug based on the compound esketamine. I mean, that in itself, maybe you can opine on that, Ritu, is something.
Exactly. I think that this cultural aspect of psychedelics is in the rearview mirror. I mean, going back to GW, for instance, I mean, that came out of an English company, and God bless CEO, the old CEO, Justin, before he sold it, but he was a rather understated Englishman. He was not an edgelord by any stretch of the imagination. And none are any of these guys, right? Like if you look at RA, if you look at Ansbert, who took Reunion public, I mean, he'll forgive me, no, not an edgelord, just a standard biotech venture capitalist. They're not making any sort of cultural statement. They are basically looking at the data, they're looking at what will help patients and what will help the bottom line at the end of the day. So I believe that when you go from the agency, which I think has shaken those concerns, to investors, and if you look at those investors, they're maybe a little more forward thinking, but they're not the edgy ones. All the way to insurance companies, and we've done extensive payer work consistently every 6 months on the neuropsychiatry space. Part of our conferences, we ask payers about this. They're actually usually slightly ahead of investors. They are eager for drugs that will have high remission rates, because that means less money to spend on the patient. They're out the door and they're all better. That concern is not there on the payer side that we have consistently seen in our surveys.
And when you look at the cap table of some of the psychedelic biotechs, they've got the kind of crossover funds in there, so-called Boston Mafia, who buy in ahead of potential M&A from big pharma. Michael, when you look at, for instance, Compass or something like that, is there a chance now going forward, in the not too distant future, we may get a big pharma buying into the psychedelic biotech space?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just on the cap table point, right? If you look at Compass, Cybin, MindMed, right? I feel some of the financings that have been consummated in the last 9 to 12 months, I think you've seen a lot more of the mainstream biotech healthcare specialists that have been funding the space for the last decade come into these names. I think the amount of capital the specialists hold today is much larger than it's ever been. If you look at the top 20 funds from RA to Orbimed on down, it's probably north of $100 billion in assets. I think ultimately the thesis is twofold, right? It's being able to bet on positive clinical data or binary events, and ultimately how to, the pathway to getting a product or a drug to market and commercialization. I think the reality is in biotech, not many companies get to commercialization on their own, are able to build that infrastructure. So the ultimate exit does require a commercialization partner of a scale of a larger mature company, whether it be big pharma, big biotech, companies that come before them, that can put that infrastructure in place so that you don't have competing field forces and that kind of OpEx spend that, despite $100 billion, like that's hard capital to find.
And how much is everyone encouraged by just big pharma getting involved in neuropsych again? I mean, there was 2 huge deals towards the end of last year. AbbVie buying into Cerevel, Bristol Myers Squibb buying Karuna, which has an anti-schizophrenia treatment, which has a PDUFA date later this year. Presumably, even though that's not psychedelics, that just shows that like big pharma's thinking about neuropsych again, right?
It was huge.
Yeah.
Covering the space, it was enormous, because over the last 10 years, I went from seeing Lilly being the flagship neuropsych company to like, Lilly's an obesity company now, right? Who would have thought? Everybody was divesting. There was no M&A in the space, and Oliver, you're absolutely right. The exit for most of my specialist investors is a large pharma takeout. That's what those big balance sheets are doing. They're taking out smaller companies so that other ones can emerge behind them, essentially. So those large multiple takeouts suggest that large pharma sees the unmet need that was laid out before us in the prior presentation, sees the need for new therapies, and neuropsych for the longest time was like, oh, let's have a long-acting X or, you know, an extended release Y. None of that was interesting. When I became a senior analyst in 2010, the neuropsych panel at Cowen was led by our specialty pharmacy analyst, because that's how little, you know, let's just say less innovation was being done in the space. And now it's being run by me and my colleague on the biotech space.
And what's, Protik, do you want to chip in?
I'm just going to make one point on that, and that's just to talk about this inflection point for a second. There are only, the reality is, and I think you guys will agree, there are only so many pools of capital that exist to take from where you are on the left side of Dan Grossman's slide to the right side of Dan Grossman's slide. And there are only so many different partners who can commercialize that. And so at the same time, we have to recognize that the incentive structures within, you know, large-scale pharma at times and the traditional biotech, bioinvestor community are not necessarily completely aligned with what this field has been trying to build. And we just have to acknowledge that tension. I think we will require this capital, but it's why the earlier stage companies that are, let me put it this way, the companies that are getting to go first, like Lykos, and others that will fall behind Lykos from a commercialization standpoint, how we do it and how we finance it will, I think, set the pace and the precedent for how then mainstream biopharma and mainstream investment capital comes into the space. That's why the opportunity is pretty vital that we get even the manner in which we do it correct.
Let's get a bit to some of the calculus of like the challenges around these as commercial stage assets, which we may see, and hopefully, I suppose from your perspective, we'll see later in the year with an approval from Lykos. IP, how much is that a problem, Protik? You guys don't have a 20-year IP period, you've got a data exclusivity period for a few years.
I wouldn't say a few years, but that's not. No, look, and Michael and Ritu could probably speak better to this than I can. Again, you often find with traditional biopharma investors are somewhat formulaic in the way they invest, right? Literally formulaic in the way they invest. And so I think IP can be an issue. I find Spravato a fascinating case study in this point as well, right? You've got a drug that's been a generic for 50 years that's going to be J&J's fastest growth year-on-year product. So I think there are, I don't think the IP question is as fatal as some people make it out to be. I think the far more interesting question for a lot of investors is going to be the actual commercialization pathway. Will payers pay? What is patient access going to look like? Are the results in the field actually going to be the results that are in the trial? I think that's the kind of stuff that I think, and Michael and Ritu should jump in, are going to be equally, if not more important than the patent estate. The patent estate's important, but I think there are other elements that are going to be pretty important for them.
Michael, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I think the investors that I speak with, I think they ask the question for sure. I think there are companies that are doing things, whether with Catalent or others, to try to create an IP estate around what they're doing. But I also think this is a sector where there's reasonably high barriers to entry for people who are first movers. And if you build the infrastructure in place and have that kind of out there and kind of for others to benefit from, I think being first and having the capital to run at it hard does create some meaningful barriers to entry for others.
Is that when you speak to kind of like the big pharma side of stuff, is that what you heard, like any reluctance over the IP?
There is. Big pharma tends to get reluctant about a lot of things, but there is literally a formula, right? Like when I value companies, some of the parts, like an asset has a net present value, right? And that depends on the duration of asset, which is a fancy word of saying how long do your patents go out to. And if you don't have the patents, that's like brake screeching right there. So that extension value drives the value of an asset. That being said, there are ways to navigate around it, as big pharma has shown, much to many people's chagrin. They've taken very little and gone very, very far with it. So there are going to be ways in the existing patent law of the US to patent uses purity, isoforms, polymorphs. There are many, many strategies, and somebody just needs to show that you can use it and it'll hold up. And that will be an established strategy going forward. The other thing is, when you think about the first generations and you think about what sort of therapy and monitoring needs to go around it, I mean, that just feeds into what the FDA is probably going to do and institute a REMS, a risk
Evaluation mitigation
mitigation strategy. I always forget the E. But basically, the FDA requires that a drug be given in a certain way with a certain access point. And it makes it very hard for generics to just pick it up and just put it out there, because oftentimes you can patent the methodologies around how it's given. So that's like an extra layer. So there are ways. I think it's really more, and we'll talk about this, the access points and the delivery points that are currently the basis of most of my investor discussions.
And let's get on to that, because I suppose we look at Spravato. That doesn't have a therapy element to it, but you do have to go into a clinic and take it, I think, over 2 sessions. Correct me if I'm wrong.
longer.
It's
Lycos,
ongoing.
several hours of therapy associated with taking MDMA. Compass, synthetic form of psilocybin, also involves therapy as a treatment for treatment-resistant depression. The likes of AbbVie, Pfizer, Lilly, they're not used to doing psychotherapy, right? And that's part of the equation when they're looking into whether they can buy into this space, and also the complications around the rollout of that. Speak to me a little bit, Protik, about how that is something that you have to kind of explain, work around. Presumably right now you've got a whole sales force building up to the launch of potential launch of Lycos later this year, around how you actually do all of that.
I think it's going to be kind of one of the fundamental questions that potential investors, potential partners are going to have is this drug plus therapy component. And I was joking with the head of an unnamed publicly traded company recently, congratulating this person on recent results. And I was joking because this company has this debate of whether or not therapy is important or not to the actual treatment. And I was having a joke with another CEO of a company who was saying this. I was like, my guess is going to be, depending on how Lycos does, you'll either lean fully into therapy being very important, or fully like, I've never heard of therapy in my life before. Like, that's going to be exactly what they're going to do. So I think this combination of drug plus therapy combination is new. I think that there are, we do have examples of where one is able to deal with hours and hours of care. Obviously, it's not an apples-to-apples comparison, but you have rheumatology, dialysis. I mean, there are other systems of care that exist where you are able to keep a patient, in an actual place for X number of hours, et cetera. But I think there will be the system of care still needs to be built. And I think there is a lot of drafting off of Lycos that can be done. I truly think that the tailwind, not Lycos, Spravato, that can be done. Like the Venn diagrams don't overlap 100%, but they certainly aren't in different universes. So I think there's certainly a lot of drafting that can be done. But I also think that this conversation around how you get both the therapy reimbursed as well as the drug reimbursed in as seamless enough or frictionless enough fashion is going to be something that the space is going to look very, very hard at.
And the challenges around delivery is maybe it was partly the pandemic, but the challenges around delivery is what made Spravato quite a slow burn, and now this year it stands to turn into a blockbuster. Is it fair to expect that from Lycos as well? Is that a kind of fair assumption that it will end up being quite a slow burn rollout? Maybe you could opine on that, Ritu.
So the treatment burden is different. Obviously, you need to have the trained therapist to run the exposure therapy, and we just got finished talking about the lack of clinicians, neuropsychiatry clinicians in the country. The time period, the bookable time period that you need the room for, that real estate footprint is also a big deal. What's interesting is that you do have what I've been seeing. You're starting to see different real estate footprints of neuropsychiatry practices. Where I am in suburban DC, you're actually seeing individual neuropsychiatry practices that give ketamine and have a TMS machine. So they actually have a coordinator that, they have a bunch of rooms and a coordinator. So we're getting there, that the baby steps are starting to get there. Psychiatrists aren't now thinking of, you know, a nurse in the front room who is taking the calls and one room in the back, and that's their practice. So that's already starting to evolve. But more and more is going to be needed. I think, for instance, one of the things that held back Spravato, I think like at Mass General initially during the rollout in ketamine, like they were fighting for infusion beds with the oncology center. And oncology makes like a ton of money for these hospitals. Like you are not going to get a bed from oncology for the infused oncology medicines. But once that separate infusion center had been set up, apparently it went from being a money loser for the hospital to like break even. So it's it's almost the real estate footprint of these things as it gets emerged, and being able to schedule patients and make it worth 12 hours of this real estate footprint to ensure a point of access.
Michael, when you look at the space, is there more kind of nervousness from the institutional side, from big pharma, from investors over the rollout or over the insurance reimbursement piece? And I would highly recommend, if anyone's an FT subscriber, there's a piece by my colleague Emma Jacobs about ketamine being covered by various employers, you know, which is actually still somewhat of a rarity. Yeah. Which one tends to kind of provoke more concern, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think two thoughts. I think it's probably a combination of both. But I think for many investors, a lot of biotech investors are very focused on assessing, you know, clinical data, right? And think about probability of success getting through phase 2 and phase 3. And it's almost a different group of investors that then focus on commercialization. So for a lot of the companies that are raising that are earlier stage, well, that's a question. I think there's still plenty of value creation along the way from a Series A or a Series B before you get to a point where that's a concern, right? And I think many of these companies are evaluations where there's meaningful room, right, for everyone to accrete value along the way to commercialization. I think ultimately, that is a question on everyone's minds, right? What is the end kind of product opportunity, addressable market, revenue potential? But I think for most companies, it's still a little bit further out. And it's a different risk profile that you're thinking about, right? A return profile that you're investing towards.
Again, it's going to be something that's proven out through Lykos's potential launch, right? How much, I mean, in a sense, how much can we read into like the responsiveness of payers and insurers to cover Lykos for the rest of the sector in the next 5-10 years? Project.
It's tough to generalize completely, but I think a lot of eyes will be on the actual reimbursement pathway, access pathway that Lykos, you know, pending approval, will experience come next year, come early next year. I also think that presents an opportunity, though, for Lykos. I think our view, certainly at Helena, is that Lykos will and can potentially be the commercialization partner of choice for the entire psychedelic ecosystem because of the time, attention, and the hundreds of millions of dollars being spent to actually build out the hard yards of actually plugging this all together. It doesn't make a lot of sense for others to spend the time and money to replicate that again in this market. And so we do think if we get it right, I think at Lykos, that other different molecules, other different things in this class of products could actually build on the commercialization infrastructure. But I think a lot of eyes will be on how the company does it in the beginning.
And I was with a pharma services banker just yesterday, and we were talking a little bit about how if you look at the kind of mental health clinic space, psych clinic space, there's not been a huge amount of consolidation in that space at all for the last few years, well, decades, years. Is that something to expect, that like whether it's Lykos or whether it's someone else, there has to be some kind of infrastructure built over the next kind of few years to actually deliver all these treatments that might get approval from the FDA? Is that something to expect, Ritu?
It has to be. Right now, there has to be more access points, and it has to be a magnitude above what we have right now for these numbers to work. It's not to say that they won't be built. I think one interesting precedent is actually gene therapies. We're seeing more and more gene therapies built out, and the investor focus on access centers is particularly acute. That's how we build our revenue models, and how much can something sell in a quarter? How many access points are there? What's their patient throughput? We ask the doctors this. So the more, the better. And there comes a point where the number of access points exceeds the number of patients insurance is willing to cover, and that will be a great point to get to. That is a high-class problem. But right now, I don't see the psychedelic space and the number of centers available to administer these drugs as bumping up against insurance's willingness. Now we're talking like 6 years from now, 7 years from now. So that could change. But right where we are, I don't see those access points bumping up against insurance's unwillingness to pay if the remission data in the phase 3s is what I suspect and predict it will be.
So in effect, the rate limiting step at the moment isn't going to be the infrastructure, like the clinics, everything put together. It's maybe more the insurer side of stuff.
I hope so. If the build out is, if the build out continues, it may be insurance 7 years from now. But I think one important development for me was the CPT codes and the development of the CPT codes to operationalize this, and that made me and my revenue model for Compass feel a whole lot better about my 2030, 2031 revenue estimates.
Presumably that's something that people are thinking about at Lykos project, which is just like, this is complicated, right? You have to go and bill for the drug. You guys aren't providing the therapy. You have to bill for the therapy. That's a whole different kind of landscape than what normally the payer system's used to dealing with.
Yeah, I agree with Ritu that I think that as long as the results hold, that this does not break the system from an insurance standpoint, from a reimbursement standpoint. The TAM isn't big enough, the numbers aren't big enough. This does not break the system. But I do think that the delivery infrastructure, that the delivery supply chain, everything from the therapist training piece of it to the the outcome monitoring, the phase 4, all of that kind of needs to it's still pretty nascent. And in some ways, there was this buildup a few years ago. A lot of therapists trained, a lot of different clinics making bets on having commercial enterprises. And in some ways, they were a little too early. And what you saw is a lot of them kind of flamed out, ran out of cash, ran out of whatever, because they didn't quite time it right, because the actual drug infrastructure wasn't there. Lykos is not where it is, Compass isn't where it is, et cetera, et cetera. Now that's actually coming to pass. So I do think that as an investor, I think the ecosystem space is a fascinating space to invest in. Because I think right now there's going to be a pain point where, as Lykos and others start rolling out, as I'm always told to say, if the drug is FDA approved, you will still have a gap, I think, between. I think the first couple of quarters are going to be a little interesting, but I think ultimately, as the throughput starts, you start to see a gap in the delivery infrastructure and the actual patient demand for the treatment.
I want to ask you this project, but I'll ask Ritu instead, because I don't want to worry the attorneys if they're watching. The AdCom. Is it likely to reflect some of the things that have come up in this conversation? It's going to be stuff
100%.
about labeling. It's going to be stuff about the nature of the clinical trials, the question of whether you can blind it or not, all that stuff.
100%. I mean, Compass just had their earnings call. This earnings week is starting
yesterday,
to run
right?
to yesterday morning. That's
but
right.
Did Compass trade down off the back of the Lykos AdCom news a little bit? Sometimes it moves.
I think it was just the market.
Yeah.
I didn't see a real read-through to it, but I will tell you that the last couple of questions on that earnings call focused on the AdCom, and certainly when I had my follow-up call with management, I asked for what are they focusing on? What is going to come out of it? And we wrote it up as part of our note, which is out and in the public domain, but we think that investors will be paying very, very close attention to the overall risk-benefit, including aspects of the safety profile that were mentioned at the scientific conferences, even including longer-term safety, something that I think at ACMP was called post-treatment emotional lability, that was the term they threw out. So we think that that's going to be a long-term safety aspect that they focus on as part of risk-benefit. But also, how does FDA regulate the therapeutic component, which FDA does not have mandate to regulate? So, I mean, it's the core of what the Lykos therapy is built around, and FDA has a legal mandate to regulate the outside part of it, but not the inside part of it. But like if you change the inside part of it, it could be completely different. So how are they going to move forward with that, maybe in the terms of REMS? So I would say those three things are what we're focusing on the most that have direct read-through to the companies we cover, Compass, GH, the other ones we're looking at in the space, we cover HI as well.
Michael, if Lykos gets its approval, if Compass has a kind of fantastic phase 3 readout, it could all start to look pretty rosy for psychedelic biotechs over the next couple of years after that. Presumably the funding environment will improve, the strategic interest will improve, the possibility of partnerships, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's increment. I mean, these are meaningful de-risking events for the space, right? Another approval of an MDMA therapy, right? Positive phase 3 data for Compass at the end of the year. I think investors always look for these types of inflection points to put capital towards other ideas that could take advantage of or benefit from, right? That type of de-risking. I think we've already seen meaningful shifts in terms of institutional investor interest in this space, and that should only broaden. Right? I think there are investors that 6 months ago, when I had a conversation with them, said, I don't think this is something that our organization or our LPs can get comfortable with. And lo and behold, 6 months later, they've made a few investments. So I think we've seen movement on that already. And as the product opportunity crystallizes, I think you'll see more and more investors follow suit.
Because there's a lot of early stage, mid-stage products that are going to need a whole bunch of capital, right, to get them through later stage trials and get them towards commercialization. Can we expect Helena to invest more in the psychedelic space outside of Lykos? Absolutely, something that you guys are interested in.
Absolutely, absolutely. I didn't think I'd say this a year ago, but we are absolutely going to double down on the space. We think there are interesting opportunities on the training side. We think there are interesting opportunities on the actual care delivery side, and there are interesting opportunities on the early stage molecule side. I think, as Michael said before, the early stage molecule is a little bit of a different game because what you're depending on there are the essential valuation bump ups as something moves through from an earlier stage to a mid stage product, and then the real money is for commercialization. Whereas Lykos, we came in late, but I think we're very bullish on the space right now. Actually.
Why a year ago did you think no? What changed? Sorry.
You're the moderator now.
Sorry.
No, I thought that the space, personally, I think we felt that, one, the space wasn't, I guess twofold. One is we did not at that point want to take any early stage regulatory risk. So that was just that was just a boundary breaking for the fund. We will hopefully open up a way to invest in those kinds of molecules in the future. So that was number one. Number two, I think when we originally started looking at MAPS PBC, which then became Lykos, I think for us it was originally a complicated story because of the spin out from the MAPS not-for-profit, the kind of hybrid, is it philanthropic, is it not philanthropic kind of model. And so, when I'm sitting, Alan Schwartz, who works with Michael, Alan Schwartz is the executive chair of Guggenheim Partners. He's on my IC, the GP in Helena. So I never thought I'd be pitching like an MDMA deal on a Guggenheim conference room on Madison Avenue in my life. And so there were only so many things, Ritu, that could be different, right? You can't say, it's got this therapy, it's got this not-for-profit. At a certain point, everyone's eyes glaze over and say, let me just pass on the deal. So a lot of what got us comfortable was the work we jointly did with Rick, with the team at MAPS, with the team at PBC, to kind of make the asset look a bit more standard. And in doing that, I think the opportunity in this space became so clear. Like so clear that Lykos was just the beginning. But it took doing the work over 11 months to get us there. It wasn't obvious to us.
Where does the story head next in terms of actual compounds? You guys have MDMA, Compass have synthetic psilocybin, there's DMT stuff, there's talk about stuff like ibogaine on a more speculative level. Seaport Steve Paul, who was behind Karuna, is coming out with, well, very early stage, but looking at researching kind of non-psychedelics, non-hallucinogenic psychedelics. Is that where it heads? What's your feelings about that, Ritu?
The easy answer is it's going where the IP is, which is new chemical entities. You've got a 20-year IP life. And you do want to look at, as long as you're doing that, you're using the medicinal chemistry to basically design therapies that will have a shorter and shorter safety monitoring window. It's much less about what the psychedelic experience is and more about, one, is duration necessary to confer clinical benefit, because you don't necessarily want a weaker drug, if that is ever proven. But the second thing is, how do you make it more capitally efficient to administer, which basically means shortening the time period. So insofar as these second-gen drugs are being engineered, that is the main goal, to shorten that window. Third generation, I'm having conversations, is to completely decouple the clinical benefit from the experience, period. And those are very, very early. There hasn't been a whole lot in the public domain, either from the second gen or the third gens, on safety. And I would say that one of the things the field has benefited from in the investor space, and plain vanilla, standard biotech specialist, is the fact that there is this extensive use history, this extensive, pile of literature from the UK, from Hopkins, proving safety over and over again. These are naturally derived compounds with so much safety and tolerability experience. Like, we know what we're dealing with. Whenever you have a new chemical entity, you are throwing all that out the window. And anything can happen with a chemically engineered, medicinally engineered compound. You can have on-target side effects, unexpected. You can have off-target side effects. Those are the big ones that come out of nowhere and have real big problems. So that is something. With the second gen, you get IP, you may get a better profile, but you really got to watch that early safety, which the first gen products have not had to worry about. So there will be scrutiny on that.
Michael, where's your instinct about how the next generation of kind of psychedelic-focused biotechs heads?
Yeah, it's a good question. Maybe I'll answer it in a slightly different way. Like, I still think that there are still, for mainstream investors, institutional investors, healthcare specialists, mutual funds eventually, if we get there, right?
State Street, taking a position.
There is still so much value to be created in the existing kind of later stage mature companies today. So we're not talking about companies that are $5, $6, $7 billion in valuation. We're talking about companies that are sub-billion, sub-500 million in most cases. There's still a lot of opportunity as investors get more comfortable with the space, and a lot of value to be created and money to be made investing in Gen 1, right? I think Ritu's obviously right. I think companies that have new molecules, better IP, more optimized medicinal chemistry, I think that's certainly where the next wave is coming. That may be further away than we think.
Which...
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm out in print saying that if Compass's first phase 3 works, that's $1 billion in value, market cap created for Compass, without even the waves and the de-risking of the space going forward, and at least $1 more billion of value tacked onto Compass itself.
And so when do I get to write about some M&A? Like, which big pharma do you think is probably going to be most interested in buying one of these assets? I mean, Lilly had obviously had a huge neuroscience division, down-ramped it now. It's now the weight loss drug company. It's going to have a lot of money to spend over the next few years. AbbVie's shown interest in the space. Bristol obviously has bought Karuna, maybe less money in the coffers there. What's your instinct about the kind of the BD departments of big pharma that are more enthusiastic about this?
Very few have said, no, we are not interested. The only one is Biogen, and I'm just as content for them not to do anything around this space, frankly. I think you're right. There are companies that are sniffing back around the space. If you go into the Karuna merger documents, fun fact, this is what passes for fun in our sector, looking at the history of the transaction, who talked to who when, who basically ghosted such offer, or basically looked at the data room and said no thank you, who was left hanging, who was outbid, right? It's all in there. It's just called company A, B, and C, and then we all
How
get
many
to
where
guess
does it
who
go? Company A, company D?
B, I mean, I've seen up to like company L in cases, but we all play guess who company D was, or something like that. But if you put together the takeouts that we've seen Cerevel, we've seen Karuna, there are companies left hanging, and there are big companies left hanging who were able to write big checks. I think that they have to get past the access component, and their own legal departments have to get comfortable with IP. But this is just a sleeve. Psychedelics have just become another mechanistic sleeve in the opportunity that is the next generation of neuropsychiatry drugs. Whether we're talking psychedelics, whether we're talking muscarinics, whether we're talking GABAergic agents.
Let's not forget, actually, when you think about Karuna, that came from, I think the muscarinic was originally developed at Lilly, and it was passed through a few different places before it ended up in the hands of Bristol. Is your expectation, Michael, that Big Pharma will eventually buy into like the out-and-out psychedelic space in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think there's definitely going to be strategic interest, but it may take different forms, right? I think pharma, typically has lots of balance sheet firepower, and R&D dollars, and EPS and P&L is more scarce, right? So I think thinking about whether the form of those investments is strategic investments out of the venture arms, licensing transactions, right, versus straight M&A, right? It's probably a combination of all of those things.
And are you thinking, Protek, about a partner at some point for Lykos?
I'm always not speaking for Lykos. I just think I'm always thinking about partnerships in this space. And I think particularly as you look at the delivery infrastructure, I think ultimately that delivery infrastructure will look more consolidated than one might think. And that's kind of on brand given who the patient actually is, right? These are overlapping indications. These are overlapping pathologies. And I think ultimately what you're going to see with psychiatric care, with psychedelic care, is that ultimately a patient is not just going to need or benefit from one treatment or one type of therapeutic modality, right? The Venn diagrams between someone who has PTSD, treatment-resistant depression, potentially traumatic brain injury, et cetera, these are often the same patient. And so I think as the system matures, you'll start to see a more sophisticated, holistic care delivery system that actually is more aligned with what the patient actually needs, as opposed to kind of a fragmented thing where you go to this for your psychedelic care and this place for this kind of COI care. And I think as that happens, that's the kind of consolidation that I think larger players will like to see, because they don't want to make any one individual bet. They probably want to bet a little bit on a holistic kind of care package.
And I think there's some mechanism by which we can get an audience Q&A going. I don't know if Kelsey's still around, but hopefully you can ask them. I'll just kick off with one final kind of summative point, which is it's been a kind of more arid environment for funding for biotechs in general. That's now picking up. There's been so far, I think, Michael can correct me, probably, I think 9 IPOs so far this year. And a lot of the XBI, the biotech index, is very much linked with just interest rates. I mean, it's
10-year yield.
Yeah, 10-year yield, exactly. Yeah. How much is that just going to make this all a lot easier when that funding environment eases for psychedelic biotechs, just as a simple tailwind?
Yeah, I think when we think about risk, right? I think risk assets, right, tend to do less well, right, in higher rate environments. I think if we see some movement on inflation, the Fed start to cut rates in September or later this year, whenever that happens, that should be a boon for our entire sector. It's, at the end of the day, it's almost math, right? DCF values are higher, depending on the discount rate, right? So I do think the investor enthusiasm in terms of capital allocation has been very, very correlated with the macro right now. I think there have been some idiosyncratic things to biotech that have been very positive to our sector, like all the M&A, like de-risking data events. But I think with a healthier market, for sure, right? People's risk appetites go up, and they want to invest in situations that have higher potential returns.
And maybe last point we could touch on is just, what do you think is still the thing that's putting investors off most from psychedelics that needs to kind of change or will change over the next couple of years, Ritu?
I think it's the access.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think it's the access. If I had to pick one of everything, look, clinical data is important, and like I said, there's $1 billion of value to be added. That risk is almost less perceived to be from the compound itself, because for various reasons, whether it was because they read the stack of literature or personal experience, most of the specialists that I've spoken to believe these drugs work. But the placebo effect in neuropsych trials, any neuropsych trial, is a problem. It was why nobody wanted it when I came to Cowen in 2014. People didn't want to deal, not with the drugs, but with the placebo effect of every neuropsych study. That can be gotten past, but it's the lack of precedent on figuring out the access and the operations that is the biggest point of debate, and one where I personally don't have answers to, and I'm watching very, very closely to get that sort of last mile. That is the last mile to my revenue estimates in my mind.
Michael, do you think there's still a factor of putting people, I mean, part of it clearly with institutional investors is they've liked that the space has become more professionalized, slightly less kind of kooky over the last few years?
Yeah, I think investors like to invest in things that there's positive correlates for, right? So I think we need overall kind of more success in the space. People can say, I know what happened here. If I invest at this point in the inflection curve, I can expect X, Y, and Z to happen, right? So I think as more companies mature, raise capital, get through positive data events, adcoms, approvals, I think all of those things just help investors it creates a blueprint for the next wave of investing in the space.
Gotcha. Ritu?
Yeah, something I've said before is there's still a lot of questions on the access side, a lot of questions on the reimbursement side, et cetera. But I think ultimately, as I've said in a different form, investors love investing in inevitability. And this is inevitable as a tool in the mental health toolkit. And so the curve will be nonlinear as to how it'll go from here to scale. But I think if you're willing to take some risk and look a few years out, it's hard not to bet on the success of this space. And so if those can think a little bit beyond the kind of quarter-to-quarter mentality and think a few years out, I think it's a very investable space.
And a date for another inflection point to put in your calendar is June 4th, the AdCom, which will be virtual and very interesting to watch. We're out of time, but let's go through and thank Suprotik Basu from Helena, Michael Jiang from Guggenheim, and Ritu from Cowen. Thanks very much for listening.